Converted man here?
It's the converted man.
Converted man here. Today's video idea was submitted by Molecular. Molecular, this is all your fault. Top 10 most common atheist arguments and why they fail. It seems that many atheists today, some like to use the title New Atheists to distinguish them from the more profound philosophical atheists of yesteryear, have very little to add to the discussion. To be fair, the same goes with most Christian apologists. By Eric Hyde. And here's this cartoon. Did Yuri Gagarin say he didn't see God in space? On atheist fanaticism. That wasn't very funny of a cartoon. Oh well, whatever. I write very little in the area of Christian versus atheist apologetics, and for good reason. You don't know anything about it? Oh, sorry. I was in an atheist chat rooms and blogs that I first cut my teeth in theology many years ago. Since those days, I've not heard anything new from atheists. Well, 2Q, back at ya, baby. I haven't heard a dang new thing from any theist yet. Oh well. It seems that many atheists today, some like to use the title New Atheists to distinguish, hey, this was your header, I'm not reading this again. However, I thought it would be fun to comment on the 10 arguments I hear the most. My hope is that it will help expose some of those more obvious problems with them, and maybe help both sides, atheists and Christian alike, to move on to more interesting debate material. One additional note, another reason I do not enter into the atheist-Christian debate world much anymore is because of the sheer discourtesy that both sides tend to show the other. I will not delete any comments, yeah right, no matter how uncivil or juvenile they become, because for me, it is an important part of the article. The responses, if there are any, will demonstrate the current state of atheist versus Christian banter. Also, I will not respond to rude posts. This is an advance warning, so please don't think me rude as well if I ignore them. Okay, here we go. So, a lot of excuses to why he's going to ignore whatever comments are left, because they might be rude, like asking a question. Oh, that was rude. You said it in a rude way. How do you know it's rude? Okay, whatever. Moving on. Number 1. There is no evidence for God's existence. There are a couple problems with this line, starting with the idea of evidence. What exactly does one mean by evidence? What is sufficient evidence for one person is often not sufficient evidence for another. A court of law provides innumerable examples of how two parties can possess the same collection of data, the same power of logic and reasoning, yet argue for completely different interpretations of the data. The old saying is true. The facts do not determine the argument determines the facts. Okay, we've got equivocation, false analogy, and argument ad antiquatum, which we haven't heard in a very, very long time. So equivocation on what does evidence mean? What kind of evidence? Any evidence, any sort. What do you got? Do you have empirical evidence? Do you have historical evidence? Do you have archaeological evidence? Do you have... What sort of evidence do you have? I think that it's meant to be open to interpretation so that you can say, I've got this evidence. Okay, let's examine that. Let's explore whether or not that's evidence or not in the first place, and then let's go from there. So this is just, I would submit, is equivocation to pretend like, well, I don't know what you mean by evidence. Well, that's something I try to avoid. I always ask for empirical evidence when asking for the 3 things that I ask for. Empirical evidence, repeatable test, logically coherent argument. Moving on to the next fallacy, we have one giant false analogy. Here we're going to talk about a courtroom. Courtrooms and how they work are not how informal logic works. Now, if you were to take God to court, I think God would lose. You can't call him to the witness stand, and there really isn't much evidence you could present for a particular God or for God at all. In fact, what could you present other than fallacious arguments, which might pass in the court of law, maybe, but aren't going to pass within the realm of informal logic. And since we're talking philosophy here, the only system that I'm aware of in philosophy that can get to an outcome is informal and formal logic. And in my case, I'm just going to stick with informal logic because I don't want to get into all those weird shapes and stuff, because putting that on my screen just... No, that's not going to happen anytime soon. So, moving on. Oh, wait, not yet. Sorry. Argument ad antiquatum, which, by the way, feel free to correct me on this one, where he says the old saying is true, the facts, blah, 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 blah. The best I could come up with is that's fallacious. I don't care what the old saying says. So it's either irrelevant or it's an argument to antiquity. It's an argument to tradition. I don't care what some old saying says. Plus, I don't agree with that old saying anyways, because no, the argument does not determine the facts, because the facts are the facts, irrelevant to whatever arguments you might provide. When confronted with the charge that there is no evidence for God, the Christian often does not know where to start with a rebuttal. It's as G.K. Charleston once said, asking a Christian to prove God's existence is like asking someone to prove the existence of civilization. What is one to do but point and say, look, there's a chair, and look, there's a building, etc. How can one prove civilization by merely selecting a piece here and a piece there as sufficient proofs rather than having an experience of civilization as a whole? Okay, so this is an appeal to authority, because I don't care who G.K. Charleston is or what he said. But what's interesting to me is two things. One is that in the earlier paragraph he complained that evidence was vague. What do you mean by evidence? It could be anything. I don't know. Well, what do you mean by civilization? It could be anything. I don't know. So why pick a vague term? And does a chair in a building really prove civilization? And by the way, isn't civilization a universal concept, meaning that it exists solely in the mind and nowhere else? Even a particular civilization only exists in the brain. It's the concept of civilization is a concept. It's not a real thing like a building is a thing. Okay? Civilization is a very loose concept that we've come up with to describe something bigger than what we otherwise would have words for. So if you're using this analogy, then God too would be a concept that exists solely in the mind. So you gotta pick. Either you gain false analogy, or this is done, and I've won because you've agreed with me that God exists as a concept in the mind. But it is a false analogy. Ding nabbit. Wish I wasn't so freaking honest. Because God, even a God classified by Christians, is nowhere near civilization. I mean, it's far more complex, and I would think then be far harder to demonstrate than civilization would be. So, this analogy fails. Darn it. Nearly everything the Christian lays eyes on is proof of God's existence because he sees the handiwork of God all around him in creation. But this is hardly sufficient evidence in the court of atheist opinion, a court which presupposes that only what can be apprehended by the senses rightly qualifies as evidence. For the Christian who believes in a transcendent God, he can offer no such evidence. To produce material evidence for God is, ironically, to disprove a transcendent God and cast out faith. Amazingly enough, there's only one logical fallacy in this paragraph, and that is straw man. Because not all atheists would presuppose that the only thing that counts as sufficient evidence are things that are apprehended by the senses. More on that in a moment, however. This paragraph actually answers the complaint. So the complaint is there's no evidence for God's existence, and the answer is you're right, there is none. That's the answer. The answer is there isn't any, if we're talking about empirical evidence. So, again, back to his complaint, we don't really know what evidence is, but we're going on the assumption now that all atheists have a certain way of looking at the world, although, again, that's a straw man. It might not be true. It might be true of many, but not all. But we're going to go on that assumption and think that atheists need empirical evidence. Therefore, the answer to their statement, there's no evidence for God, because they mean empirical evidence, would be, you're right, there is no empirical evidence of God, because God is transcendent, which is an assertion made by the Christian, to which the atheist would probably reply, what's transcendent? Can you prove transcendence? And the answer to that is no, because you can't prove transcendence. So the answer to this argument is there is no evidence for God's existence, at least not the Christian version of God. Even though the Christian themselves in this scenario sees God in almost everything, or sees the handiwork of God in almost everything, that doesn't mean that that is the handiwork of God in everything. It just means that they associate patterns of things that they see, probably pretty things rather than nasty things, I would assume. You know, looking at a rainbow versus looking at a bunch of leeches. You know, it's harder to look at leeches and go, oh, that's the handiwork of God. Although, fairly enough, maybe they might do that. Although I doubt it. Let me go back to the only way to know stuff is by the senses. Well, no and yes. No, because we have tests, we have different experimentations that we can run. But we still need our senses to make sense of the data. So, yeah, we still need senses. So imagine somebody with no hearing. That's easy enough. No sight. Also, we know of people like this. No sense of touch. Now, somebody like that might not survive long without help, but they cannot hear, they cannot see, they cannot feel anything. In fact, they don't feel hungry. They don't feel any... How would we communicate with such a person? Even though they might have the ability to speak, unless they grew up with hearing and then lost that hearing later, they would be essentially mute. They'd be trapped inside their own mind. How could we ever hope to communicate with such a person? We might find some way, but to that person, the world doesn't really exist, because they have no way to apprehend the world around them. This sense that we're trying to talk about here in this article, in this single paragraph, if I dig deep, is that sense of God that some people can feel, right? But you can only get to that sense if you're able to, by your brain's own chemistry, and you're told about it. Or something happens and you feel this thing and you don't have any other explanation but God. And you pick a God that is widely accepted in your culture, more than likely. But for the person in the scenario that has no sight, no sound, no touch, that person will feel all sorts of feelings, none of which we would necessarily call God, but all of which could be God for all we know. But since we have no way to communicate to them and they to us, the world outside doesn't exist. And that's a scary thought, because I don't think any of us would ever want to be in that position. I think that it would not be long before that person lost their sanity. But my point is this: the feelings that such a person would have would be unnameable to them, because they have no classifications to give to those different senses that they would feel inside their brain, and that's all that those feelings would be in their brain. Nowhere else. They don't have a connection with the outside world. The only way a feeling of God comes about is by being introduced into the concept of God, and then being told that that feeling you just felt, that's God. Or by feeling an odd feeling and not being able to explain it, and saying, well, what is it? I don't know. Well, my culture says it's God, so it's God. Unless you can prove transcendence, which you can't, because to prove transcendence would also be to negate the sort of God that the Christian believes in. So the answer to there's no evidence for God, at least for the Christian, is you're right, there is none. It's all about faith, which is what that last sentence hammers in. If we had proof of God, we wouldn't need faith. The second part of the line is equally short-sighted. What does one mean by existence? If one means that which has come into existence, then surely God does not exist, because God never came into existence. He always was. He is eternal. This was a famous assessment of the matter by Salvin, whatever, dealing with the incarnation of Christ. The argument is a bit involved, so for time's sake, I'll just have to state it and leave it there. So here again we have an appeal to authority. Some guy that I don't care about said something, and we also have equivocation. What do you mean by existence? As if I don't know what you mean by that. If you mean this, then no. If you mean that, then yes. How about is real? Okay, is that clear enough? Or should I say is real outside of our brains? Okay, God exists inside our brain as a concept. Does it exist as anything other than that out here with the rest of us? Okay, is that clear enough? Or are you gonna complain about the definitions of words more? Which would be okay if you were examining a particular argument, perhaps. But usually those arguments give definitions to words, so really, come on. So, what's also interesting to me is, I'm going to mention this argument that this guy did, but it's involved, so I'm just going to leave it there. And there's no link at all given to said argument. So if I want to find out more, I now have to Google it. Now, it has been my experience that people reading articles like this and people dealing with things like this like to be able to not have to look up what you just said. You could have a little one that leads to the bottom. Here's the argument in full. You could have a link so I can click on it. Now, I might not click on it, but it just saves me the step of having to search for that thing. Most people, I would think, are not going to go to the effort to search for that argument, because they've read this article. They're either already convinced, they just need to be reassured by this article, or they're like me and are mocking and disassembling every single piece of this article, including the fact that you don't even provide a link to an argument that you think might be helpful to the points that you're making. Number 2. If God created the universe, who created God? This is one of the more particular arguments I've come across. Those who use this charge as some sort of intellectual checkmate have simply failed to grasp what the Christian understands as eternal. It is an argument usually levied once a theist posits that a first cause or an unmoved mover is required for the existence of the universe, a necessary being upon which all other things exist by way of contingency. Some atheists then shift the weight over to the theist, saying, well then, who created God? What is a Christian to do but smile at such a question? God is the antecedent of all things in creation and is eternal. If God had a creator, then his creator would be God. God is God precisely because he does not have a creator. I think you've missed the point of this question, and I wouldn't really even call it an argument. I'd call it a question. Who created God is meant to get you, the theist, to think. Unfortunately, thanks to apologists like you, although you claim not to really be an apologist, you are doing apologetics at this moment in this article. That you've essentially found a way to stop people from thinking about this question. Well, God's always existed, so he doesn't need a creator. So we can't answer the question. But you can't think either. You've constructed this very complex entity that simply is the default state of everything. It simply has been forever, and yet has no other explanation than it simply has been there forever, which might in fact be the explanation, but you really aren't thinking about how that works. How does God think? How does God exist at all? How is it that God is able to do anything? What does it mean to be transcendent? How does God having a lot of power equal God can make things come out of nothingness by sheer force of will? Why does this God have a personality or thoughts at all? How does any of that work? But you miss all that because you simply assert, well, God's always existed, and it's the answer. It is the answer, period. And I don't need to explain the explanation any further. That's the answer. I'm sticking with it. And so the moment that science does come up with the real answer of how this universe that we know about came to be, you'll simply move the goalpost back one and say that that answer too is God, or made by God, or allowed by God, or what have you. Because at the end of the day, it's not about proof or evidence, because you already admitted you have none. It's about faith. And that's all it's ever been about. And faith just asserts, whereas facts are. Whatever reality really is, we should be able to discover that through some method. And if God is so well hidden that we won't be able to find God using that method, then the burden of problems falls back onto God, that it somehow is able to interact with something that it chooses not to be detected by. Why would it do that? Oh, well, there's an answer to that. So that people can have faith about it. Because it wants people to have faith about it and not have proof that it exists. Even though it gave some people proof a while back ago. But that was different, you see. And then it doesn't make sense when you think about it, which is what the question is made to do, is to make you think, but you found a way to stop thinking. And so this question for you is a bad question. To be fair, I would rather the question be, what is God made out of? Because that reveals a lot more about the problems of this entity called God than the question, Who made God? Okay, that's it for these 2 questions in this article. Join me again for the next 2 questions, or 3, depending on if I can fit them within 20-minute time frames. 25-minute time frames. Hopefully I'll be able to address more questions than I did here, but I need to break this into a series because people like shorter videos. I guess I could keep going, but people like shorter videos, so whatever. Unless and until we have a logically coherent argument, which so far we don't, but maybe he'll fix that later on in this article. Yeah, right. We must continue to be skeptical of the conclusions. And here comes a blooper. There's a chair, and there's a building, etc. How can one prove civilization merely...